The title of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish titles which I've had the honour to carry for so long, I now pass to Catherine.
Something happened behind the heavy doors of the royal estate that was never meant to be seen, never meant to be spoken of, and never meant to redefine the monarchy itself. In a silence broken only by footsteps and shaking breaths, Catherine was crowned in a private ceremony that carried no public announcement, no official witness list, and no return to the old order. And when Camilla learned what had taken place, she did not speak. She froze in disbelief. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside the royal household, tension has been building for months between ceremonial tradition and private authority struggles. Charles knew every corridor of the palace was tightening under pressure as he tried to balance institutional stability with growing internal demands for change. What unfolded was a private coronation-style acknowledgement, an undisclosed royal rite conducted away from the public record, where Catherine was formally recognised as the real Queen Consort Authority, meaning the symbolic holder of ceremonial influence within the monarchy's internal structure. Camilla remained outside the court proceedings, sensing exclusion from a decision she once believed was untouchable. Her presence reduced to silence behind closed doors. Catherine, meanwhile, was guided toward a sealed inner chamber, each step carrying emotional weight, as she sensed something irreversible being finalised without a full explanation. Pressure tightened inside the palace as silence replaced explanation. Catherine moved through the corridor with visible emotional strain, aware that every step brought her closer to a decision already being shaped without her full voice. Camilla sat in a separate wing, excluded and rigid, the weight of displacement settling in as she realised influence was shifting beyond her reach. Charles faced mounting pressure from senior advisors. Each conversation narrowed his options between tradition and necessary transformation. William stood between loyalty and consequence, preparing mentally for what the palace would demand of him next. By the time the decision settled into the palace structure, nothing remained unchanged. The coronation-style acknowledgement was now documented internally, locked away from the public record, creating silent shock among attendants who had witnessed its completion. Whispers moved quickly through the corridors as William prepared to face consequences that were no longer theoretical but immediate. Inside a dim ceremonial room, Catherine stood motionless as a senior court official, placed a symbolic piece of regalia before her without ceremony, her hands trembling as she accepted it. While in another wing, Camilla stopped mid-step after receiving a whispered message and stared at a closed oak door, her expression collapsing into disbelief. But what led the monarchy to such an irreversible private decision began far earlier, buried beneath layers of loyalty, silence, and quiet betrayal that no one dared to confront aloud. Before the private crowning shattered the palace's balance, each figure inside the royal circle was already carrying invisible fractures. Catherine moved through her duties with controlled composure. William stood between loyalty and legacy. Camilla held on to her established royal identity with growing unease, and Charles tried to preserve unity while sensing control slipping through his hands. What unfolded was not sudden. It was the result of emotions long buried beneath royal discipline. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had already begun carrying the weight of expanded ceremonial responsibility, stepping into roles that placed her closer to the symbolic centre of the monarchy. Her presence at key engagements was no longer optional but expected, and that expectation shaped every decision she made in silence. Camilla, the Queen Consort, maintained her formal standing, yet the atmosphere around her had begun to shift in subtle ways, as if influence itself was slowly rebalancing without announcement. Charles felt it most sharply. The king watched traditions he once controlled bend under quiet internal pressure, while William carried the added burden of protecting Catherine, while navigating the invisible boundaries set by senior royal structures. William did not speak often about what he saw changing, but behind closed doors, he struggled with the tension between duty to the institution and loyalty to Catherine. Charles, as the monarch, was forced into constant mediation, trying to hold together a system where every decision now seemed to carry emotional consequences as much as constitutional weight. Court aides began noticing something they could not officially record: a gradual divide forming in decision-making influence between households, where certain voices carried more weight in private discussions than others. Even small meetings revealed it. The pauses before agreement grew longer. The silences became more loaded than words. Camilla sat through one of those meetings without realising it would change everything. Her expression remained calm, while the room around her shifted in tone in ways she could not yet name. William stood in a corridor outside, adjusting his cufflinks with a controlled breath before entering a private meeting room, each second heightening his awareness of what was about to unfold. Inside another chamber, Camilla stared at a folded official paper she had not yet opened, her fingers refusing to move, as if instinct alone warned her of its contents. Charles moved between these spaces like a man balancing two versions of the same crown, each step carrying the weight of decisions that were no longer purely his. Yet the roots of this shift were planted long before that silence, inside a moment no one in the palace has been able to forget. A silence fell inside the palace that felt heavier than ceremony, heavier than duty, heavier than the crown itself. Long before the private crowning, there was a single moment that altered the monarchy's internal direction forever. It did not happen on a balcony or during a public event, but inside a restricted royal study where decisions were meant to remain temporary. That moment became the unseen fracture line of the entire institution. A quiet exchange of words, a sealed document, and a decision that would later return as an irreversible consequence. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stepped into that room without expecting permanence. Her presence was initially framed as observational during a confidential royal governance meeting, a structured internal session where ceremonial authority distribution is reviewed and adjusted within the monarchy's working framework. She did not yet know that her arrival would shift the emotional temperature of every voice inside the chamber. Camilla, the Queen Consort, was already seated, aware that concerns had been growing for months over representation. Balanced within royal duties and public-facing roles, yet unaware she had been excluded from the final phase of the discussion that was about to define her standing. Charles, the King, carried the weight of that imbalance silently, knowing every word spoken in this room would echo far beyond protocol. William stood closer to the edge of the discussion than anyone expected, watching the exchange between tradition and restructuring with quiet tension, knowing Catherine's position in the conversation was not accidental. Charles guided the meeting forward as concerns over representation sharpened into something more permanent, with the monarchy's internal voices acknowledging that ceremonial visibility was no longer evenly distributed across households. At first, Camilla felt not anger but distance, an absence of information that signalled her exclusion from decisions she believed still included her. Catherine remained still, absorbing details that felt heavier with every passing sentence, aware that her presence in this room was already being interpreted in ways no one openly named. A sealed internal directive appeared on the table midway through the discussion. Its contents reshaped the tone of the entire room before they were even read aloud. The document reclassified ceremonial precedents, placing Catherine in a position of unmatched symbolic authority within the monarchy's internal structure, a framework that defines who carries primary representational weight during royal duties. Charles did not interrupt as it was reviewed, allowing silence to confirm what words did not need to explain. The directive was approved without full consensus, and the moment that followed was not one of protest but of stillness, an immediate shared recognition that something irreversible had just been set in motion. A pen struck polished wood with sharp finality after the last signature was added. The sound did not echo, it settled. Catherine slowly lifted her gaze, realising the silence around her had changed meaning entirely. It was no longer procedural, but transformational. Across the table, Camilla noticed it too, the subtle withdrawal of attention, the hesitation in every glance that avoided her. William felt the shift without needing confirmation, his expression tightening as he understood that this single document would not remain confined to paper for long. What began as a quiet administrative decision would soon evolve into a direct emotional confrontation that no one inside the palace could avoid. When the truth can no longer remain buried within palace walls, confrontation becomes inevitable. In a private room with no aides, no ceremony, and no escape routes, the tension between Catherine and Camilla finally erupts into a silence that speaks louder than words. What was once restrained protocol transforms into raw emotional distance as years of hierarchy, identity, and expectation collapse into a single charged encounter. Camilla, the Queen Consort, enters first under the weight of a meeting framed as ceremonial clarification, an internal royal discussion intended to settle questions of formal duties and symbolic placement within the monarchy's structure. She carries herself with controlled composure, but the room already feels different, stripped of familiarity, as if authority has been quietly reassigned before a word is spoken. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, follows moments later, her presence steady yet visibly burdened by the knowledge that nothing discussed here will be reversible once spoken aloud. Both women understand the same unspoken truth. This is not clarification, it is confirmation. Catherine remains composed as she takes her seat, but beneath that stillness is pressure that has been building for months, shaped by expanding ceremonial responsibility and the silent expectation that her role is no longer secondary in practice, even if not declared publicly. Camilla watches her carefully, trying to maintain the authority she has always carried within the formal royal structure, yet feeling it subtly erode in the presence of decisions from which she was not fully included. Charles's earlier internal directive, the restructuring of ceremonial hierarchy, meaning the reordering of symbolic influence and public-facing royal precedents, hangs over the conversation like an unseen witness. William stands outside the immediate exchange, but remains central to its emotional weight, knowing every sentence spoken inside will ripple outward into consequence. Catherine finally speaks with restraint, her voice measured, referencing past decisions in carefully chosen words that hint at something larger already in motion. Camilla responds with controlled firmness, but the edges of her composure begin to fracture as the discussion circles closer to what was never formally named. The existence of the private crowning is not declared outright, yet it is confirmed in fragments, phrases, pauses, and the way certain decisions are referred to as already concluded. In a recorded briefing, later described by a senior court aide, the atmosphere is recalled as a room where silence was doing more talking than either voice. Camilla realises it first, not as an accusation, but as the recognition that the decision, shaping Catherine's position, was not merely an administrative adjustment, but a symbolic replacement within the monarchy's internal order. Catherine does not correct the interpretation. She does not deny it either. Instead, she remains still, carrying the weight of something already sealed before this meeting ever began. The emotional peak arrives without raised voices. Camilla pushes her chair back slightly as she stands, her voice restrained but shaking as she attempts to regain her footing in a structure that no longer responds to her presence the way it once did. Catherine does not respond immediately. She lowers her gaze for a brief moment, then rises and steps away from the table, leaving silence behind her like an unspoken verdict. Neither woman calls the other back, neither asks for the conversation to continue. The meeting ends without resolution, but something far more final settles in its place. An irreversible emotional separation that no further discussion can repair. Behind this confrontation, power itself is already shifting hands in ways no single conversation can contain. Every royal transformation appears sudden, only to those who cannot see the structure beneath it. Behind closed doors, decisions are shaped not by emotion alone, but by carefully measured authority, long-term stability planning, and silent consensus among those who rarely appear in public. The rise of Catherine's private recognition is not a spontaneous act. It is the result of calculated internal alignment within the highest levels of royal control. Charles the King moves through a series of internal briefings where every word carries the weight of institutional survival rather than personal preference. The monarchy's internal advisory structure, meaning the private council of senior officials who shape royal decision-making behind public view, has been reassessing symbolic leadership roles with growing urgency. Institutional stability has become the dominant concern, especially as public scrutiny of royal relevance intensifies, forcing every decision to be measured against long-term perception rather than tradition alone. Camilla, the Queen Consort, feels this shift indirectly through her reduced presence in strategic conversations, even as her formal title remains unchanged on paper. William, the Prince, does not sit at the centre of these meetings, yet his influence is felt in every discussion that touches Catherine's position. His support for her stability within the monarchy becomes a quiet but undeniable factor in shaping alignment among senior voices. Charles feels this pressure most sharply, caught between preserving ceremonial tradition and adapting to a structure that is already evolving, faster than official protocol can explain. Every proposal he reviews carries the same tension: maintain the crown as it was, or allow it to quietly become something new before public expectation forces change. Camilla notices the shift in a different way, not through confrontation, but through absence. Key conversations that once included her perspective now move forward without her input, replaced by a narrower circle focused on a future-facing ceremonial structure. Catherine, meanwhile, becomes the consistent reference point in those discussions. Her role is increasingly framed as central to public engagement and symbolic continuity. A documented briefing from a senior royal aide later describes the atmosphere as a quiet recalibration of influence, rather than a declared restructuring, confirming that change was already embedded long before public awareness. Charles listens to competing recommendations from a small group of senior advisors who now support elevating Catherine's ceremonial standing privately before any formal acknowledgement. Their argument is not emotional, it is strategic, rooted in the belief that gradual internal adjustment will prevent institutional shock later. Camilla's role within these same internal frameworks begins to shift subtly towards symbolic presence rather than directive influence, a change that is never announced but increasingly reflected in planning documents and meeting structures. William receives confirmation of these discussions through a recorded private briefing summary shared by an internal communications aide, and his response is measured but firm, reinforcing alignment toward Catherine as the monarchy's stabilising figure. Charles does not reject the direction outright. He studies it, weighs it, and allows silence to replace refusal. A senior advisor quietly slides a sealed folder across a polished desk toward Charles. He opens it, reads in silence, and slowly closes it again without speaking, his expression revealing acceptance without approval. The room does not move, it simply waits. But once power moves in silence, its consequences are never contained within palace walls for long. The moment the private recognition is completed, the palace does not explode. It fractures in silence. Information moves through corridors without announcement, arriving in fragments that feel more like disbelief than fact. Camilla is among the first to feel the emotional impact, while Catherine is left suspended between duty and transformation, and William is forced to confront what the monarchy will never be able to undo. Camilla, the Queen Consort, receives the first confirmation through a tightly controlled internal briefing summary delivered by a senior aide who avoids eye contact as the document is handed over. The briefing outlines subtle but undeniable adjustments in ceremonial protocol references, meaning the official hierarchy used to determine royal precedence during duties and state representation. Her reaction is not immediate anger, but stillness, the kind that signals shock too deep for words. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, is not physically present in any of these conversations, yet her presence dominates every silence that follows. William, the Prince, begins receiving parallel confirmations through internal communications channels that are no longer aligned across households. Each message reinforces the same truth. Something irreversible has already taken place. Camilla isolates herself within a private room, the door closing with a softness that feels louder than any argument. She holds a glass without drinking, her grip tightening as she reads between lines that never explicitly name what she already understands. A recorded internal aide's account later describes her state as emotionally restrained but visibly displaced, confirming that the shift was not just procedural, but personal. Catherine, meanwhile, stands in a separate wing of the palace, no longer in motion, no longer being guided through decisions, but suspended in the aftermath of being formally recognised within the monarchy's private structure. The silence around her feels heavier than instruction, as if every expectation has already been rewritten without her needing to speak. Inside administrative offices, palace officials begin quietly adjusting internal documentation to reflect the new ceremonial hierarchy, updating reference structures used for engagement planning and representation order. These changes are not announced but implemented through controlled updates, ensuring alignment before public interpretation can form. William receives confirmation of these adjustments through a secured briefing note, marked as final and non-reversible at the institutional level. He reads it once, then again, not because of confusion, but because acceptance carries weight even when it is expected. Camilla does not move for several moments after finishing her briefing summary. The glass remains untouched. Across the palace, Catherine stands in front of a mirror, not adjusting her appearance or preparing for an event, but processing the absence of explanation surrounding her new position. William remains caught between both realities, understanding that what has shifted is no longer subject to negotiation. A senior communications official is later quoted in a restricted internal transcript, stating that the alignment has already been structurally absorbed, confirming that reversal is no longer within procedural reach. That single confirmation removes any remaining illusion of flexibility. The monarchy is no longer preparing for change, it is already living within it. And as the internal shock settles, a far more dangerous force begins to build outside the palace: public attention. Power within the monarchy does not shift only through ceremony, it transforms through loyalty. In a private, unguarded moment, between William and Catherine, the weight of what has been done finally surfaces without institutional language to hide behind. For the first time, the decision is not about protocol or hierarchy, but about what it means for them personally as individuals bound together inside an unrecognisable system. William, the prince, enters the room already carrying the pressure of what cannot be undone. His thoughts are shaped by confirmations received through internal royal communications that now point in only one direction. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stands near the window, not looking out, but holding herself still as if movement itself might collapse what remains of her emotional control. The absence of aides, advisors, or formal structure turns the space into something heavier than any ceremony, because nothing here can be softened by protocol or rewritten by institution. William knows this meeting is not about explanation. It is about acknowledgement. Catherine speaks first, her voice steady but stripped of distance, questioning not the decision itself, but the emotional cost it has already begun to carry. She refers to the private recognition, an internal royal confirmation, meaning an undisclosed acknowledgement of ceremonial authority within the monarchy's private hierarchy, not as a triumph, but as something that has changed the way she feels inside her own life. William listens without interrupting. The future king is caught between protecting her and accepting that protection may no longer change what has already been set in motion. Every sentence between them feels smaller than the silence surrounding it. William finally responds with restraint, admitting through carefully controlled words that responsibility within the institution has already moved beyond personal preference. He struggles to balance loyalty to Catherine with the understanding that institutional alignment has already shifted too far to reverse without destabilizing the monarchy itself. Catherine does not argue. Instead, she acknowledges the weight of what he is not saying, recognizing that the structure around them has already decided more than either of them can undo. The truth of the private crowning enters the conversation without announcement, carried in fragments rather than declaration. Catherine does not ask for confirmation, and William does not offer comfort disguised as denial. A recorded internal briefing summary later describes this moment as one of mutual recognition without resistance, marking the first time both fully accepted that the decision defining her position was permanent. The emotional impact is not loud. It is final in its quietness. William places a hand briefly on the edge of the table, then pulls it back as if reconsidering even that small gesture. Catherine looks at him without speaking for several seconds before finally lowering her eyes, accepting what words cannot fix. The space between them feels wider than the room itself, shaped not by distance, but by the understanding that nothing will return to how it was before. Outside this fragile silence, another force begins to rise. Internal palace communications, flagged for urgent review, confirm that media attention is no longer contained at the perimeter. Reporters, sources, and public speculation are beginning to converge on the truth that has been held inside for too long. William feels it before it arrives. Catherine does not need to hear it to know it is coming. And beyond these walls, the story is already escaping into the world at large.